Please be seated for the prayer. May we, the councillors of Ku-ring-gai, always be aware that decisions we make affect the daily lives of those we represent. May we make these decisions with knowledge and goodwill, respecting the views of others, and may we show ourselves worthy to follow in the footsteps of those who have protected the special qualities of Ku-ring-gai for over 100 years. Amen. On behalf of Council, I recognise the traditional custodians of the land, the Ku-ring-gai people on whose land we meet. I would like to outline a few points regarding this evening's proceedings. Tonight's meeting will be live streamed on the Council website at www.kmc.nsw.gov.au/livestream. Only councillors and council staff will be shown on camera. The webcast of the meeting will remain on the website until the minutes of the meeting are formally adopted by Council. The webcast commences once the Mayor is seated and will cease if Council goes into a confidential session where the public and the press are excluded, pursuant to Section 10A of the Local Government Act. Council meetings remain open to the public as observers, but in line with the Code of Meeting Practice, speakers will now address the Council through the monthly public forums and not at Council meetings. For more information about addressing Council, please visit our website at www.kmc.nsw.gov.au. All present tonight must refrain from engaging in disorderly conduct, publicly alleging breaches of the Council's Code of Conduct, or making other potentially defamatory statements. Please do not film or take photos of the Council meeting. Councillors and Council staff must declare and manage any conflicts of interest they may have in relation to any item of business that is the subject of the meeting agenda this evening. Councillors, are there any apologies? Everyone seems to be here. General Manager, are there any staff apologies?
There are none from the staff, Madam Mayor.
Councillors, are there any declarations of interest? Councillor Kay.
Okay, GB19, the Environmental Levy Grant Program, a non-pecuniary lesson significant. I am actually on the Wild Things New South Wales. I'm a committee member and there's a grant there for an Intect Hotel workshop of $2,000. So on this occasion, I will be leaving the chamber.
Thank you. General Manager, are there any staff declarations?
There are, Madam Mayor. I'll start in relation to item C1, General Manager Performance Review. I declare a conflict of interest and the Directors and I will not be in the chamber for consideration of that matter. Mr Watson has a further declaration.
Mayor and Councillors, I will declare an interest in relation to GB1, given that I have a role in assessing a planning proposal that's currently before Council.
Thank you. General Manager, documents circulated to councillors.
Madam Mayor and Councillors, there are a number. Behind the bright greens, there is a late Mayoral Minute 2, bushfire emergency, together with Petition 2, petition for the proposed synthetic surface at Rove Park Mimosa Sports Ground. Behind the other set of greens, there are 3 memos in relation to GB17 from the Director of Strategy and Environment of today's date, together with a memo from the same Director in relation to NM1, planning proposal for 45 to 47 Tennyson Avenue and 105 Eastern Road. And there is a late memo, a standalone memo of today's date from the Director of Strategy and Environment in relation to GB13, post-exhibition consideration of submissions, local strategic planning statement, a minor amendment to the wording contained on page 45 of the statement.
Thank you. General Manager, would you also please list reports to be considered in closed meeting?
Madam Mayor and Councillors, item C1, which I alluded to earlier, General Manager Performance Review. report and attachments 1 and 2. Item C2, potential acquisition of land, St Ives, the report proper and attachments 1 through 3. GB1 RFT 05-2019 Linfield Hub Developer Tender Readiness, attachments 1, 2, 3, 5 and 6. And GB10 RFT 9-2019 Cleaning Council Buildings and Amenities, attachments 1 and 2.
Councillors, I seek a motion that those items remain confidential. Moved Councillor Shadow, seconded Councillor Kelly. All those in favour? That is unanimous. Councillors, we move to confirmation of the minutes of the ordinary meeting of Council held on the 22nd of October 2019. I seek a motion. Moved Councillor Clark, seconded Councillor Shadow. All those in favour? That is unanimous. There are 2 mayoral minutes this evening. The first is MM1, Waste Recycling, as printed, and the recommendation is on page 38 as printed. I won't read that out because it's on the screen and in your business papers. So I will move that motion. If there's nobody who wishes to comment on it, I'll put it fairly promptly. No speakers. I'll move that motion as printed. All those in favour? That is unanimous. I move to MM2, which I hope you have a copy of in your greens. Bushfire emergency. I'll read this as it is not in the business papers. Last week, Council experienced a bushfire emergency that could have been catastrophic, particularly for the South Turramurra community. Of all the councils in the Sydney metropolitan area, Ku-ring-gai has one of the highest proportions of properties on bushfire-prone land, so we know that we always need to be extremely vigilant. On behalf of Council, I want to recognise the hard work of many people who work on bushfire preparedness and those who respond when an emergency event occurs. Last week, Turramurra was the focus of firefighting efforts. A fixed-wing aircraft and helicopter were used to release fire retardant and help protect homes and lives at Canoon Road. The RFS, Fire and Rescue and other emergency services were on the ground. This past week, Council staff have been cleaning residents' homes affected by last Tuesday's fires free of charge. The clean-up took several days. On the weekend, the South Turramurra community came together to raise funds for the RFS and thank all the emergency services who came to their aid during the fire emergency. I attended the event at Aluba Oval, and the very successful turnout from the local community raised close to $10,000. The community spirit was palpable in showing their gratitude and generosity for the assistance they received from all services and, importantly, raising bushfire awareness. The RFS are the lead agency when fighting bushfires, and it must be remembered that the vast majority of their members are volunteers. These selfless men and women take time out from their jobs, in some cases using their leave entitlements, to put their lives on the line and keep our community safe. We cannot thank them enough for what they do. I would also like to thank the Council staff for their tireless and difficult work during the bushfire emergency last week. A number of our staff worked late into the night and even all night. Council staff were also in attendance at the Control Centre in Cowan. It makes me proud to be Mayor when I see this level of dedication to our community. Because of our high risk, Ku-ring-gai Council staff and emergency service personnel work together continually to reduce the risk of bushfire. Most recently, Council staff and those from the National Parks and Wildlife Service and Fire and Rescue New South Wales conducted major hazard reduction work on over 25.5 hectares of bushland at Twin Creeks Reserve, Turramurra. Over 90 staff took part in the operation, which included 12 FRNSW fire engines, the Council's new fire tanker, and 2 NPWS fire units. Supporting the burn-off from the air was a helicopter provided by New South Wales State Air. Aside from hazard reduction work, a big part of bushfire preparedness is community education. The Council and the RFS have been hosting a series of free community information workshops as part of its Get Ready Ku-ring-gai bushfire awareness campaign. The workshops profile the Council's innovative sim table, which through a 3D simulation shows residents how a bushfire could start and spread in their local area. The sessions will also help residents prepare plans for what they would do if a bushfire breaks out in their neighbourhood. The sim table has received widespread media coverage, most notably in this week's Sydney Morning Herald. Ku-ring-gai Council is the first local government authority in Australia to pioneer this technology, largely thanks to a grant obtained from LG-NSW. Preparedness and vigilance remain vital as the summer season is yet to commence. It is reassuring that Council, emergency services and the community are all working together based on well-researched protocols. I commend all those involved in last week's operations, and I move that this mayoral minute be received and noted, and that the Mayor write to the RFS, Fire and Rescue, Emergency Services and Council staff, thanking them for their efforts. Are there any comments from councillors? Councillor Pettit.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. It's amazing that through adversity and through such a potentially horrendous fire event that the community in South Turramurra and the wider community, they all banded together very quickly. And the thank you to the RFS and Volunteers Day there on the Saturday. The numbers of people that actually attended was phenomenal. This was an event put on at very short notice, and I mean very, very short notice. And you couldn't park close to the event. You had people coming from far and wide, and it was all day. And I'd also like to thank the cricketers for putting on some pretty good games as well too. So, as one of the local ward councillors, very proud of the efforts all round. And on behalf of Council, thank you very much for all those that attended, and thanks the volunteers.
If there are no further councillor comments, I will put that minute. All those in favour? That is unanimous. We move to petitions. There is one in the business paper to start with. PT1, petition to keep natural grass at Mimosa Oval. Is there a mover for that petition? Councillor Clark is moving that, which will be to, no doubt, receive and note that petition and that it be referred to the relevant officer for attention. Seconded by Councillor Pettit. All those in favour? That is unanimous. Also, you will note in the greens circulated, there's PT2, a petition for the proposed synthetic surface at Rove Park Mimosa Sports Ground. Is there a mover for that petition? Councillor Pettit.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Happy to move PT2 without reading it out, that the petition be received and referred to the appropriate officer of Council for attention.
Thank you. Seconded by Councillor Clark. All those in favour? That is unanimous. We move to RC1, minutes of the Ku-ring-gai Traffic Committee, 17th of October 2019. I seek a motion to receive and note those minutes. That is moved Councillor Spencer, seconded Councillor Pettit. All those in favour? That is unanimous. We move to general business, and I invite councillors to nominate any item on the or items on the agenda that they wish to have a site inspection. None. I invite councillors to nominate any item on the agenda that they wish to adopt in accordance with the officer's recommendation, allowing for minor changes without debate. Councillor Shadow.
Yes, Madam Mayor, I'd like to recommend a GB1, the Linfield Village Hub Developer, the tender readiness document.
We'll just wait a moment while the Director leaves the chamber. So, Councillor Shadow has moved GB1 as printed, recommendation as printed. That is seconded by Councillor Nye. All those in favour? That is unanimous.
GB2, Council Meeting and Public Forum dates for 2020. Officer's recommendation.
Seconded by Councillor Smith. All those in favour? The Director is just returning. That is unanimous. Thank you.
GB3, the Model Code of Conduct, Councillors' Consultation, Gifts and Benefits. Officer's recommendation.
Seconded by Councillor Clark. All those in favour? That is unanimous.
GB4, the 4th Annual Smart Local Government Summit, that any councillors wishing to attend it notify the General Manager by the 8th of December.
Seconded by Councillor Kelly. All those in favour? That is unanimous.
And GB5, the 2019 to 20 budget review, the first quarter, that it be moved and the recommended changes received and noted.
Seconded by Councillor Smith. All those in favour? That is unanimous.
GB6, analysis of land environment court costs, recommendation that we receive and note those costs.
Seconded by Councillor Smith. All those in favour? That is unanimous.
GB7, the investment report is at 31st of October. That it be received and noticed and the certificate of the responsible accounting officer be noted and report adopted.
Seconded by Councillor Kelly. All those in favour? That is unanimous.
GB8, development and regulation policy reviews and updates, the officer's recommendation.
Seconded by Councillor Clark. All those in favour? That is unanimous.
GB9, the waste management strategy, the officer's recommendation.
Seconded by Councillor Clark. All those in favour? That is unanimous.
GB10, the tender, RFT 2019 cleaning, council buildings and amenities, the officer's recommendation.
Seconded by Councillor Kelly. All those in favour? That is unanimous.
GB11, the traffic committee meeting dates for 2020, officer's recommendation.
Seconded by Councillor Spencer. All those in favour? That is unanimous.
GB12, environmentally friendly fixtures in public places, that the report be received and noted. That's the officer's recommendation.
Seconded by Councillor Nye. All those in favour? That is unanimous.
I could move GB13, but I believe with the amendment.
Yes.
But I think I would like to deal with that perhaps a little later.
Okay.
GB14, the update report on the development contribution system, the officer's recommendation.
Seconded by Councillor Smith. All those in favour? That is unanimous.
GB15, the submission on the single-use plastic and sustainable event management policies, officer's recommendation.
Seconded by Councillor Clark. All those in favour? That is unanimous.
GB16, the baseball softball batting cage proposal at Sir David Martin Reserve, Aluba 3, South Turramurra, officer's recommendation.
Seconded by...
approve of the installation.
Thank you. Seconded by Councillor Pettit. All those in favour? That is unanimous.
I'll leave GB17. GB18, policy updates, commercial leasing policy, acquisition, divestment land policy, easement management policy and planning agreement policy, the officer's recommendation.
Seconded by Councillor Kelly. All those in favour? That is unanimous.
The Environmental Levy Grant Program, GB19.
We're just waiting for Councillor Kay to depart the chamber. Thank you, Councillor Shadow.
Sorry, GB19, the officer's recommendation.
Yes, officer's recommendation for the Environmental Levy Grant Program, seconded by Councillor Clark. All those in favour? That is unanimous.
I will leave NM1 and I will leave NM2. I can move C1, I believe.
Yes, you may.
I'd like to move C1.
Withdrawn by Councillor Kelly.
And C2, which is potential acquisition of land St Ives.
Is there a seconder for that? Seconded Councillor Kay. All those in favour? That is unanimous.
Thank you, Madam.
Thank you. GB13.
Oh, sorry.
Yep. Councillors, we are therefore turning to GB13, post-exhibition consideration of submissions, local strategic planning statement, and I seek a motion. Councillor Nye.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I would like to move a slightly different version of GB13. It should be on the computer screen. And we may amend point C of this when we come to it. So should I just say it is printed, or do I have to read all the words?
As printed is fine. As long
Okay,
as we
so
can.
I'd like to move GB13 as printed. The bulk of the change is towards the bottom of that one page, which involves amending attachment A4 to include some alternate links for Dalrymple Hay Nature Reserve in the green grid, and to recognise the special conservation agreements for Dalrymple for Sheldon Forest. And point C, we will also amend to reflect what Director Watson has recommended for point B previously.
All right, if all councillors have read that, is there a seconder for that motion? Seconded by Councillor Pettit. Councillor Nye, would you like to speak to that?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So this change is quite a minor change. It just adds Dalrymple Reserve and Sheldon Forest to just some additional words to talk about how we need to recognise the significance of these remaining parchments or remaining parcels of Blue Gum High Forest. It also talks about the green grid. Now, the green grid, according to the Greater Sydney Commission, is a map where we as Sydney, we are encouraging residents to walk along certain paths, to travel along certain paths, to really just enjoy themselves, exercise, transport, do things like that. Now, the diversion noted here is that for Dalrymple Reserve, instead of encouraging residents to walk straight through Dalrymple Reserve in St Ives, we instead encourage residents to walk along Pentecost and Rosedale. Now that doesn't prevent residents actually walking through Dalrymple Reserve, but it just means for the purpose of a map, for the purpose of encouraging residents to keep physically fit and active, that they do take an alternate path, so that these parcels of land, which are really some of the remaining parcels of Blue Gum High Forest in Sydney can be preserved where possible in its current state. I also note that for Dalrymple Reserve, out of the 1% of Blue Gum High Forest that still remains in New South Wales, Dalrymple Reserve is half of that. So it's quite a significant parcel of land that we should seek to protect and preserve as Ku-ring-gai Council. Thank you.
Councillor Pettit, as seconder.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. It was very good of Councillor and I to fine-tune things, and I think it's very important that when we're looking at a green grid and access through various locations that we encourage people to enjoy it, but also look after it. And once again, it's very simple, nothing too dramatic here, but I'd urge all councillors to support this.
Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Question through you to the relevant officer. I'm just hoping for some staff comments about this amendment and the implications that this amendment could have to the LSPS and the green grid more broadly.
Director Watson.
Through you, Madam Mayor. We did cover this in the pre-brief. I don't agree with the premise on which the amendment is based, but the words as you read them I don't find necessarily offensive, so I don't think they would necessarily detract from our capacity to get the LSPS adopted at all. I don't think the green grid is meant to represent some sort of superhighway that encourages people through the middle of things, but all the words do is clarify exactly what we want to achieve later on, so that's fine.
Councillor Nye, may I ask a question? You will note that there was a memo with a change of wording tonight. Are you meaning to have that incorporated in the wording that you're...
Yes, Madam Mayor, it's incorporated under point C, which is on the screen now.
Just wanted to clarify that. Councillor Chatto.
Yes, I'd be certainly prepared to support that. My question, Madam Mayor, is just, I did notice that we received quite a lengthy late submission from folk, and I was wondering if I could ask a couple of questions through you, Madam Mayor, Director Watson, Director of Strategy, about this. I understand that there were a number of recommendations made for this particular document, the Local Strategic Planning Statement, that are valuable but not appropriate for this particular document. I understand that there is a housing strategy to be spoken about and also a green strategy. Perhaps if the Director would like to comment on that. Director
Watson.
Through you, Madam Mayor. A number of the late submissions in relation to the green grid have been reflected in the amendment or the motion put forward by Councillor Nye, so those issues are covered, and a large number of the issues covered in the specific folk submission would be covered off in a subsequent housing strategy, yes.
Thank you very much. Just need clarification for that.
If there are no further speakers on this matter, Councillor Nye, do you wish to sum up?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I would encourage all councillors to consider this motion. It basically encourages people to respect our existing Blue Gum High Forest and try to walk around it where possible. It doesn't ban people from walking through. That is still a possibility, but it does propose an alternate route for people in this specific area of St Ives to go along Pentecost and along Rosedale, which I've walked along just half an hour ago, and it was quite pleasant. Thank you.
I will put that motion, Councillor Nye's motion. All those in favour? That is unanimous. That takes us to GB 17, proposed synthetic surface at Rove Park, Mimosa Sports Ground, South Turramurra, and I seek a motion. Councillor Pettit.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I've passed earlier a new motion on this particular agenda item and just wait for that to come up on the screen.
think all councillors have been able to read that. It goes to point C and finishes there. Is there a second for that? Seconded, Councillor Kelly. Councillor Pettit, do you wish to speak to that motion?
Indeed, Madam Mayor. Councillors, this has certainly been a contentious issue. Normally, I think what council would try to achieve is bringing all sides together rather than dividing them. With this particular new motion, we are progressing with a synthetic field, but we are putting it in a location where it is best suited for the wider community. Now, unfortunately, I don't want to be a councillor that puts in a synthetic field in the second best location. I think the football club deserve the best location for their synthetic field. We have a precinct down in West Pymble that is very much a sporting one. We have Bicentennial Park, Loughburg, got the netball courts, the West Pymble Football Club. We've renovated the West Pymble Football Club clubhouse. So why not give them their best field option? Why put it in a secondary location? Now, councillors, when you read through the council report, we have a preliminary impact assessment. And then it goes through and says, basically, once we've approved this, then it says, following finalisation of the detailed plans and approval via a detailed environmental assessment, the project can proceed. So we're approving the project on a preliminary, and then after it's been approved, we actually go ahead and do the detailed one. Doesn't that sound like we've got things in the wrong sequence? To a mere mortal like me, it does. Maybe to other people it doesn't. Councillors, if you look at the traffic as well on page 566, and the traffic assessment was done in February 2018. February is not normally a month which the football club is playing. Curious. However, in the 4:30 p.m. time slot for training, we are saying that 85% of vehicles coming there will be just dropping off and picking up, and only 15% staying. That I find very hard to believe in today's world. The majority of parents today will drop their child off for training and stay. So I don't see how only 15% will be there. I think it would be more likely 50% plus that will be dropping their kids off for training and staying. So I'm finding that traffic assessment a little bit hard to believe. Councillors, under section 5.5, subdivision 2 of the EPA Act, provides that council has a duty to consider environmental impacts on the carrying out of activities such as this proposal. Subsection 1 requires that when considering an activity, council must examine and take into account to the fullest extent possible all matters affecting or likely to affect the environment by reason of that activity. Councillors, does a preliminary impact assessment fit that bill? Is that the fullest extent of our assessment? No, it is not. It is not. And even councillors, when you look at the numbers that are put forward, normally we ask for a lot more detail. When spending money, we like to see detailed financial analysis, regardless of what project and wherever it is. So with this motion, we are putting our synthetic field in the appropriate location, which will bring the community back together. The footballers will have it in their spot. We will look after Mimosa as a natural grass field. That needs to be upgraded and looked after. It's a win-win situation. When you walk on Mimosa, walk back and forth. It slopes. It's not flat. Does it make sense to have a a synthetic field there. The facilities are not there for the footballers. Their clubhouse is in West Pymble. Let them have their synthetic field, but put it in the right location, Councillor. So I commend this motion to do the right thing and leave a long legacy of having a synthetic field in the right location.
Councillor Kelly is seconded. Do you wish to speak now?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I had this really great technical presentation in my mind, but Councillor Pettit's stolen most of it, so I'll be very brief. I think like a lot of the councillors here, and I obviously don't speak for them, but certainly in the days and weeks leading up to tonight's meeting, I've been really torn over this issue. Obviously, Mimosa's not in my ward. I mean, we'd love to have something like this in Gordon, I'm sure. But I've seen both sides of the argument. I've met with and discussed the issues, the pros and cons of synthetic fields, the pros and cons of not having synthetic fields, and I was really quite ambivalent, I guess, in a way, as to which way to go. And of course, we have an obligation as councillors not to judge these things too quickly, but to leave an open mind until we get to the point where we have all the information that we need to be able to make a decision. I share Councillor Pettit's concerns about not having all the information in one aspect, but then I was thinking about it and I thought, no, actually our obligation is to represent the community, and whether it's a commercial enterprise or a club or whatever, and in some cases those commercial enterprises and clubs do represent the community. However, in the case of Mimosa, the representation by the people who've spoken out for retention of Mimosa as a natural grass playing field, the passion that I've heard, the logic in some cases has been pretty compelling, but I can see the logic of the artificial surface as well. But I'm just feel inclined that the pendulum, in my case, has swung in favour of retaining Mimosa as a natural surface playing field. And so, like Councillor Pettit, I commend his amendments to you, and I think that the greater community will appreciate that measure. So that's completes my presentation. Thank you.
Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'm going to start with a few questions first for you to the relevant director. So there was a number of statements made about the process that council would be going through. Should council either proceed with, I suppose, this amendment, or if we were to proceed with the original motion as printed. So I was hoping, through you, Madam Mayor, to the officer, should we now proceed with either motion, what would be the process that we'd be going through? Would these fields be immediately built? Would we be going through more design consultation phases coming back to council? Through you.
Director Watson.
Through you, Madam Mayor. At this point in time, we haven't done any consultation around Norman Griffiths, but we've certainly done a lot more detailed design in relation to drainage and environmental issues at Norman Griffiths than we have at Mimosa. You would proceed through a similar process, preparing an REF and getting sign-off from that. The REFs don't usually come back to council. In fact, I can't recall them ever coming to council. So council would, depending on a motion that was successful tonight, what the exact words were, there's funding issues to be resolved and design issues to be resolved, but council would see it on a number of occasions to do full budget allocations and accept a tender.
Thank you. For you again, Madam Mayor, I suppose potentially to Director Corporate, there's been a number of implications made by members of the community that council has $100 million for projects around. I was hoping, if through you, Madam Mayor, if we could comment on our financial situation, and do we in fact have large pools of money sitting around for projects such as this?
Director Marshall.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. The Section 94 funds that we hold have been collected for specific purposes, so they can't be just used arbitrarily on new projects such as this. So, so those funds aren't available now. And as to whether there's other pools of money lying around, Councillor, you'd be aware that we have a number of large projects in our capital works program that are currently unfunded. They include the Marion Street Theatre, St Ives High, sports facility, which rely on asset sales. We're also embarking on large hub projects, Linfield Village Green, which are massive capital commitments. So undertaking additional projects such as this will be challenging and would require Council to reprioritise its capital works program.
Thank you. I suppose my next question comes down to flood risk at Norman Griffith. There's been a number of, there was a study done on the potential flood risk at Norman Griffith and the potential to mitigate some of those flood risks. So through you, Madam Mayor, to the relevant officer, if they could please comment on the potential of flood risk and what that would mean if we were to proceed at Norman Griffith versus Mimosa.
Director Watson.
Through you, Madam Mayor, I have an expert in the gallery who's going to address some of these questions, but I'll have a crack until I get the nod otherwise. The preliminary designs, the number of designs we looked at for Norman Griffiths, the 2% annual exceedance probability on which the detention tank system was designed effectively says that Council is happy to have a 2% chance that that facility would flood in any 1 year, more commonly known as the 1 in 50, but it effectively says that you're happy for that facility to flood 2% chance every year. I would have said that synthetic, rubber-filled or cork-filled turf in a detention basin was fundamentally incompatible. You would see potentially 1 year in 50 or 2% chance every year, a large part of that rubber infill or the infill material being dislodged, if not completely exported off the site.
Thank you. Another question. Sorry, I've got quite a number of fields. It's easier to do this through a number of questions.
Right ahead.
For you, Madam Mayor, to Director Watson, I believe. Director Watson, you mentioned the infill. You mentioned rubber than potentially cork. There's been a number of members in the community who have been concerned about the potential for infill, especially rubber, which is not particularly great for the environment. Would Council be considering rubber as an infill, or what else would we potentially be looking at for a project such as this?
Director Watson.
Through you, Madam Mayor, we've not to the best of my knowledge ever said we were looking at a rubber infill at Mimosa or Norman Griffiths. We've always been contemplating a cork type infill, though because of where we are in the design stage, we haven't specified a type of turf product yet. But we installed rubber infill at both NTRA and Eaton Road, and there's also a similar type material I understand down at the futsal courts in West Linfield. That's what you would call old technology now, and we'd probably be looking at a different type of synthetic infill.
Councillor Nye. Were you next, Councillor Kay? Sorry, I don't have that screen in front of me. Councillor Kay.
That's okay. So through the General Manager to the relevant Director, it's just a question. Are there any repercussions if we're moving this back to Norman Griffith in relation to the grants that we've received? So if you could confirm that would be fantastic.
Director Watson.
Through you, Madam Mayor, as was alluded to earlier, the large part of the money available for the project, as described in the report, comes from the club, from various sources. We have already sought approval to move that from Norman Griffiths to Rove Park, and we were successful. It's not for me to speculate about whether or not they would lose the grant if they were to move it back to Norman Griffiths, but because Council doesn't have the additional several $1 million of funding for its part to move the project back, delays in securing funding may well or could potentially bring the club's funding into jeopardy, yes. But that's not a question that I can speculate on. That's a question to take up with the grant providers, and there's various of those.
Have we
Councillor Kane.
provided grant extensions before?
Director
to this
Watson.
nature?
It's not our grant, so I can't say whether they're going to get a grant extension or not.
Thank you.
Councillor Nye.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. A question through to the relevant director through the General Manager. I'm just a little bit confused because at the most recent briefing that I attended, we talked about potentially using cork at Mimosa, which is better for the environment than rubber. But then when we were talking about Norman Griffiths just then, which has a 1 in 50 year chance of flooding, we were talking about rubber. So we've sort of clarified it, we sort of haven't clarified it, but can we please confirm that if we choose Norman Griffiths or if we choose Mimosa, whether there is some weird rule where it's rubber for Norman Griffiths and cork for Mimosa, or is it cork for both, or is it rubber for both, or it's yet to be determined?
Thank you, Councillor Nye. Director Watson.
Cork for both, Madam Mayor.
Cork for both. I might just ask a few questions, Director, because we did have a detailed pre-briefing tonight from staff, but only 6 councillors were able to be present for that. So Councillor Pettit was not able to be present. In his speech this evening, he stated that Council was approving this based on a preliminary EIS. Would you be able to please explain to all councillors what was detailed in the pre-briefing about that aspect?
Through you, Madam Mayor, the procurement process envisaged here is that depending on whether Council is supportive of the project tonight, we would go off and have a detailed REF prepared by an external consultant. If it was a D&C contract, there would be a hold point in the contract where the project would not proceed to construction in the event a satisfactory REF was able to be obtained. And a hybrid version of that is that we would do sufficient work in advance of going to construction tender to get an REF anyway. So Council isn't being asked to sign off on a preliminary assessment of impacts or an REF tonight, simply to go to that next stage in detailed design and approvals. And as I alluded to earlier, in my recollection, Council has never signed off on an REF ever, including for Norman Griffiths or Eaton Road. Sorry, North Turramurra or Eaton Road.
So that was a correct, an incorrect statement from Councillor Pettit in his debate on this matter. Also, Councillor Pettit did mention that Council is used to more detail on financial analysis before making Council decisions. I notice Councillor Pettit's motion has no detail of financial analysis on this proposal, changing to Norman Griffith. Could you please explain the ramifications in terms of financial impact of such a decision?
Through you, Madam Mayor, the costs prepared by Jacobs are 2016-2017 vintage. They're only a relatively high level, and at that point in time, they alluded to costs of in the order of $1.7 million for underground detention, and that didn't, I understand, include things like a gross pollutant trap, which you would put in place to pick up any material that was exported off the site with water falling or running across the site. We would expect that to be in the order of another $250,000. And as I said, there's a couple of years escalation since then, and they're only relatively high level costings anyway.
And at this stage, there would be no identified source for the extra costs involved in shifting the locations. Director Watson.
Through you, Madam Mayor, that's correct. There's no additional funding. In fact, of the funding identified in this report for Council's contribution to synthetic at Mimosa and turf at Norman Griffith, there's $450,000 of that order tied to asset sales, which, as was alluded to earlier by the Director Corporate, have not yet materialised. So there's a funding shortfall of $500,000 already, let alone the additional costs I just spoke about.
Would you please also outline the facts about the expected environmental impacts by a synthetic field at Norman Griffith in terms of flooding and also in terms of movement of synthetic material?
That one, Madam Mayor, I will phone a friend.
Ms Findlay.
On? Working? Yes, so the Jacobs report, as we said earlier, was looking at mitigating, making sure that the oval doesn't flood for a 2% or a 1 in 50 year event. The way that the synthetic sports fields are constructed, if it does happen to flood, then all of the grass and the cork and all the other infill materials can potentially be washed downstream. So in the case of Norman Griffiths, it'd be washed down into Quarry Creek. There's another number of other issues with that, not only the plastic and other materials being washed into the creek system there, but also there's a rather large culvert that goes under Yanko Road, and there is the potential that if the whole surface managed to go down and block the culvert there in that event, then you would get more flow over Yanko Road. The alternative in the report was looking at not providing that detention up to the same, up to a 1 in 50 year event, but then you would have other impacts with increased velocities downstream and more erosion in the creek through Bicentennial Park, and potentially impacts on flow over Yanko Road during a large event. So,
can you explain the implications of additional flow on Yanko Road?
It would mean increased risk to people travelling around during a flood emergency. So it would be people trying to, as you know, one of the big rules is you don't drive through floodwaters, because there's the high risk that your car is going to get taken away and you end up in more trouble. So there's going to be barriers to emergency services and people trying to move around in the event of a flood. It was only getting over in that 2% event. That's what needs to be considered.
Thank you, Ms Finlay. Councillor Shadow.
Yes, Madam Mayor, I do have a few questions. Just looking here at the economic theme for the proposal, and it seems to me we're looking at council putting up $1.5 million to either Norman Griffiths or to Rofe Park for a synthetic surface. Perhaps could, through you, Madam Mayor, to Director Marshall or Director Watson, whoever is capable of answering that question.
Director Watson.
Through you, Madam Mayor. As I alluded to earlier, there are funding shortfalls in what isn't available until there are asset sales. But the view taken in this report is that for less than the cost of putting the detention tanks under Norman Griffiths, you could get a very good quality upgrade to the turf surface at Norman Griffiths and a conventional synthetic field up at Mimosa. So that is the logic here of that $1.5 million. Gets you 2 fields for less than the price of 1.
Right, thank you very much. Good. Well, then I'd like to speak. I'm happy to support Part A of Councillor Pettit's notice of motion or motion. However, for those of us, and I don't know how many of us there are, who are very concerned about the use of plastic, of forgetting cork or forgetting rubber, the use of plastic for a surface, for a playing surface, then really plastic just simply isn't an option. In an area like Ku-ring-gai, where you have bird life, wildlife that feeds on the grass, you know, birds foraging for worms, the danger that they're going to be foraging for worms and pick up plastic and run off with it or fly off with it is somewhat alarming. Also, if we're thinking about even a plastic surface on Rofe Park, near Sheldon Forest, or near Rofe Park, near Sheldon Forest, then if you have heavy water, sounds like uranium, doesn't it? If you have a heavy flood, then wouldn't surely that affect also Mimosa Oval? Wouldn't it also flood with cork or rubber or whatever the infill is and provide hazards? So perhaps that's my question then to you, Madam Mayor, to Director Watson.
Director Watson.
Through you, Madam Mayor, the key difference between Mimosa or Rofe Park and Norman Griffiths is that Rofe Park is on the top of a hill, so it's not designed to flood. So in a heavy downpour, you would get some movement of the material, but you would not get the whole field inundated and all of the material exported. At the present time, as was alluded to, I think, by Councillor Pettit, the field does slope. But what you would do when you do any synthetic playing field is you recontour the surface. So at the moment, when I cast my eye over that field, it strikes me that the bulk of the water is flowing back towards Sheldon Forest, including whatever pesticides, fertilisers are used on the field at the moment. When you reconfigure that, you would contain and control the drainage so that it was collected and went the other way, and you would put a gross pollutant trap between the water and any outlet so that you could separate as much of the cork or whatever was being exported before it went into the normal drainage system. So what you see there now and what you would end up with would be completely different drainage systems.
Right. So then my question is, if you just put a turf surface on both Mimosa and redid Norman Griffiths with a turf surface, would that cost council any more?
Director Watson.
Through you, Madam Mayor, it's my understanding that the grants available to the clubs are for synthetic, not for turf, so it would cost council a lot more because we'd be paying all of it.
Thank you.
Councillor Nye.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. A question for Director Watson. I recently saw a tree get chopped down and the wood that was left there, like the grass is starting to grow where the tree originally was. Now, if in Mimosa we had cork, and cork is basically made out of tree bark, wouldn't we eventually have all sorts of weeds and other things grow in that area anyway? And wouldn't we need to spray some sort of pesticides on Mimosa's synthetic field if it was made out of cork? It might seem like a strange question, but it only occurred to me now.
Director Watson.
Through you, Madam Mayor, that's not my understanding of the way cork surfaces work. I imagine they have a similar maintenance type regime to what we have for the rubber, so they get raked and swept every month or so. You would expect a bit of soil or other materials to get onto the field, but because there's such a large runoff area on either side of the field, I wouldn't expect there to be any weed growth at all. So I don't understand that we spray anything on the synthetic fields. I'm getting the nod. We don't spray anything on them. They stay largely as they are. They get maintained to the point where nothing.
Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. In light of this discussion, I would like to move the original officer's recommendation with an amended point D. And that point D would read that the design process includes council constructing a pedestrian footpath around the corner of Waratah Road and Mimosa Road. That's the corner, around.
Yes.
I'm happy for a specific staff recommendation on that wording, but that would be the gist and the idea behind that.
Mm-hmm.
And then I seek a seconder for that.
Councillor Clark, would you restate that?
Of course.
extra point?
My point, D, was that that council constructs a pedestrian footpath around the corner of Waratah Road and Mimosa Road. Apologies for the
That's all right.
Yep. Not pre-written.
Is there a seconder for that motion? I will second that motion, Councillor Clark. Now, councillors, please remember that we are now dealing with an amendment, and the new adopted practices mean that we must only debate and deal with an amendment when it is on the floor. So, Councillor Clark, you wish to speak to your amendment?
Yes, I would, Madam Mayor. This has been an incredibly challenging motion, probably actually the most challenging I've had to deal with from my time of council. It's been incredibly interesting. I think the reality is, environmental Norman Griffith, it's impossible with the flood risk. When you have a 2% flood risk per year, that could lead to major flooding across Yanco. It could lead to large amounts of infill being moved. I cannot see Norman Griffith being a realistic pathway forward for the artificial turf. Therefore, we have to look at the other options. And the reality is, within Ku-ring-gai, no area is going to be perfect. It is always going to be challenging. But I believe Roth Park is the best path forward at this point in time. I think that when we have to think about the site, sorry, I'm a bit, I think, and so my point that I'm putting forward here, especially in regards to footpath, comes down to the overall road congestion issues. As Councillor Pettit correctly brought up, we're going to see up to 260 car movements per hour. Given that this is a major rat run throughout Mimosa, I'd be incredibly concerned about people walking on the road. I had to walk down there the other day when we did our site inspection at the site, and whilst I was able to walk on the side of the road, I imagine if you're pushing a stroller, you would absolutely have to go on the road. So I feel that if we're going to be increasing the amount of car movements, almost doubling them, and if we were to be moving, having more people coming to the site, then obviously we need to get pedestrians off that road. I think in Ku-ring-gai we need to understand that we need to have a 40% increase in sports fields provisions by 2036, and that's not going to be an easy process. Right? I think childhood obesity is a major issue for our area, and we need to be supporting local sport where we can. The idea that this park will not be able to be used for pickup activity is just incorrect. I've played pickup football at that field constantly from a year. I went to the Scout Hall. I'm on the other side, second Taramara. You still can perform all of these activities at a artificial turf. You could still go there and perform an pickup game of football. You could still teach scouts how to fence on the field in the evening. None of these activities are being taken away from residents. Obviously, the design process would involve a way to maximise the usage for all in an equitable way. So, and I think the point the amended point A that staff came up with was very important to this motion. So it really clarifies that we're not immediately going ahead, this is going to now happen, but now that we're going to proceed with a further study and design process to inform the review of environmental factors with view to enabling a decision whether to proceed the construction this financial year. So we're not formally locking ourselves into any process at this stage. If it comes out through the development process that there is an unacceptable environmental risk, if it just cannot work, or new traffic studies, for example, come to light, then we don't have to proceed. But at this point, I think it would be irresponsible to go ahead with Norman Griffith. I believe that council staff, as they've raised in our briefings, would be uncomfortable going forward with that process, but I could always seek clarification, and I will in a moment. So I think given that if it can't be at Norman Griffith, we have the funding, we know we have to have a 40% increase in sports fuels provision by 2036, then Rolfe Park fits the bill, it makes sense, it still has equitable use. We just do not, as brought up by Director Marshall, we do not have $100 million sitting around just to build whatever projects we want. I think this council is always, we keep chucking more and more projects onto this pile of money that we don't have. And I think that's a real concern. We're so reliant on sales that just haven't come through yet. So I see if we have the funding to actually achieve a goal and an outcome here, then we should go ahead with it. So that's why I'm committing the initial proposal to the floor, this staff's recommendation.
Thank you. As seconder, I might ask a few questions further of the staff. Director, there has been, understandably, quite a lot of focus on bushfire this week and the risks involved to our community. We've certainly discussed the flood risks tonight in relation to moving the field to Norman Griffith and the safety risks that that would pose both to the community driving on Yanko Road and their safety, and also the environmental impact of material moving from the site under flood circumstances. But could you perhaps outline the impact of the location at Mimosa with a synthetic surface and Council's consideration of surrounding fire risk there?
Through you, Madam Mayor, it's fair to say that both sites are probably exposed to bushfire risk, though it's fair to say that's probably greater at Mimosa given the proximity of Sheldon Forest. In the event of a fire, neither surface at the moment is sufficiently distant from fire-prone land to be declared a refuge, so neither of them would, even as turf fields, provide the community with any security or satisfaction. It's always open to the emergency services on the day or in an event to declare their own refuges, but there are very few locations in Ku-ring-gai because of the interface of the bushland, particularly with our playing fields, that would fit that bill. The greatest danger to both sites would be from ember attack. They would both be at risk of that. Both of them are within a couple of 100 metres of bushland that would burn. And even last week we saw that it was in fact the aquatic centre that was evacuated before South Turramurra was. So you can't say that because there's less red on a map around one site as opposed to the other, that one is more or less safe from a bushfire perspective. Because of the number of people that congregate on a regular basis down at Bicentennial Park, there is always going to be a greater need to evacuate that area in an event.
Director, are you also able to comment on the technological improvements of materials used and their ability to withstand or ameliorate fire risk?
Through you, Madam Mayor, as was covered in the briefing this afternoon, there are a number of synthetic turf providers that are doing work in the space of fire retardant or low burn synthetic fields. The video clip that I showed councillors this afternoon, albeit not necessarily scientific or largely promotional, clearly showed that there are synthetic materials out there, or synthetic turf products out there that do not burn in the way has been alleged in this debate or this process so far to date. That doesn't mean you wouldn't get some spotting and some damage to your field in the event of a fire such as we saw last week, but they are certainly not flammable in the way that has been put by some parties.
Director, can you also comment on the issues of toxicity of materials and the requirements to meet Australian standards?
Through you, Madam Mayor, all of the products that we are looking at are certified and meet Australian standards. So it's not as if we can say that they are inappropriate. There is certainly some argument or debate about the toxicity of a rubber infill, but as soon as we go to a cork infill, that argument largely dissipates. As was alluded to in the briefing, my staff have been working with some students from Macquarie University, tracking the microplastics and rubber infill that has been exported off a number of sites in Ku-ring-gai. There is some evidence close to the site, or all sites, of minor levels of material movement off-site. That dissipates the further you get away, but there is certainly no traces of contamination of any toxins above acceptable standards in any of the locations that were mapped or studied.
A number of councillors have alluded to council's obligation to provide the opportunity for young people and our community members to be able to meet needs for sporting use at sports fields, but perhaps the NESROC agreements have not been illuminated. Perhaps you could discuss the rationale between all the councils on the North Shore and environs with regard to this.
Through you, Madam Mayor, what we're seeing in the North Shore and across Sydney generally is a quite significant population increase. There is very little opportunity to provide additional playing fields. This council was lucky enough that it managed to reconfigure Cooler Park and get an extra playing field there, and it was also extremely lucky in that it was able to reconfigure the North Tarramara Golf Course and get 3 playing fields up there. But they would be the only opportunities within the existing footprint of our current playing fields to get extra fields. And those additional fields we have got will go no way at all to being able to provide for demand that is expected over the life of that NESROC strategy. So the NESROC strategy is based on getting maximum use of the fields we have at the moment, and that will include a number of things, including conversion to synthetic, provision of lights. There's also better maintenance that can get better use of the current turf fields. So it's a multi-pronged strategy, but it is in no short measure reliant on conversion of synthetic or turf fields to synthetic fields and lighting of those fields as well. It was alluded to in the briefing that you get about 7 to 10 odd years out of a synthetic field, after which time you would have to replace it. Our turf fields aren't lasting anywhere near that. They're probably, we're doing work on some fields that were done less than 10 years ago, but you're getting 3 or 4 times the use out of a synthetic field in that 7 to 10 year lifespan. So while the capital cost is a bit higher up front, the usage you get out of them far outweighs the turf field.
And I am aware that Willoughby Council's installed synthetic fields already. The Northern Beaches Council, I believe, has quite a few and more coming in. Obviously, these councils are also impacted with plenty of bushland surrounding them. Are you aware of other councils that are moving in this direction?
Through you, Madam Mayor, all of the councils you mentioned have, to my knowledge, playing fields or synthetic fields, turf fields in place or planned. Lane Cove has a number in place, as does Ryde, and Ryde has a lot more planned. So at the moment, I think from memory, we only have 2, and we're certainly nowhere near the top of the player matrix in terms of provision of synthetic fields. So all of our council colleagues around us, other than I think Mossman from memory, is planning on a rollout of synthetic fields into the future to meet the demand identified in the NESROC strategy.
My last question at this point relates to obviously the concern in the community about all members of our community having opportunities to use fields and ovals, and that they're not provided for the exclusive use of one group. Could you outline how council officers envisage dealing with this?
Through you, Madam Mayor, as has been pointed out, we haven't done a detailed design yet, but what you have at Rove Park is quite a generous footprint. So we think there's more than sufficient space for a synthetic playing field with sufficient runoff on both sides and the ends to cater for the formal sporting groups. That still leaves what we think is quite a generous area around that. There could be turf available for other users, and as you would recall from when we were out on site, we talked about the possibility of a walking track as well around that site. So because it is a reasonably generous footprint, you can get a full-size football pitch as well as some accommodation for other users of the site above and beyond what's probably carried on there at the moment.
And cricketers, Director Watson?
Through you, Madam Mayor, I think the preference would be for us to move the cricketers down to Norman Griffiths. The point has been made by them that they don't get as generous a boundary down at Norman Griffiths as they do at Mimosa. There is a little bit of capacity for us to, we think, increase the size of the playing field down at Norman Griffiths, and that will go some way, but not necessarily all the way to meeting their requirements. Bearing in mind, Council has other turf wickets in place for cricket as well. But we are trying to cause as minimum inconvenience to the least number of, or the least inconvenience to the least number of people.
Councillor Kelly.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'm going to seek your indulgence for a moment, a bit of a long preamble that might sound a bit cynical. What we've got here is two amendments, and from both ward councillors, which is quite interesting.
A point of order, we don't have two amendments. We have one motion and one amendment on the floor.
I stand corrected.
Thank you.
Councillor Clark's amendment is actually off the subject of surface, playing surface, or whatever you want to call it, whether it's synthetic or natural or whatever. And so I have a question to Councillor Clark, and that is, if Councillor Pettit was to adopt point D, which is your amendment, into his amendment, motion, beg your pardon, would you support Councillor Pettit? Because it seems that Councillor Pettit's issue is around about playing surface as opposed to a footpath, and the footpath at Mimosa could still be accommodated whether the playing surface is moved to Norman Griffith. Am I being logical? I don't know. But I think you get the drift of what I'm talking about. Both could be accommodated, I guess.
We must only debate the amendment at this point, but is there a way you wish to respond to that, Councillor Clark?
Look, I am happy to answer that. The idea around point D is to accommodate the additional traffic that would be generated if Rolf was converted into a synthetic pitch. Just my mic. No, what's on? Yeah. So whilst of course I still think at some stage we should absolutely build a footpath around that corner, I'm not convinced it should skip head of the list should we not build the artificial turf at Mimosa.
Councillor Smith. Oh, sorry, Councillor Kelly. You
I'm satisfied, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Smith.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. To be honest, I hate to speak against this motion as I've got 3 children who play sports in Ku-ring-gai. I believe it is a very important thing that's responsible for us as councillors that we need to provide for our children.
Sorry to interrupt, Councillor Smith. Are you speaking on the amendment or the motion?
On the amendment.
Okay, you just said you were speaking against the motion.
Oh, sorry.
That's all right.
Speak against the amendment.
Thank you.
There are a couple of things that I just really would like to clarify because I have done a fair bit of research into this. Director Watson referred to that there are no sprays or anything required on a synthetic oval. My understanding is there is certain types of grasses that do need to be sprayed, and it does need to be treated as it ages, is what my understanding is. I stand to be corrected, but that's what I've read in some case file.
Would you like that to
I'm
be
happy
posed
for
as a
Director
question?
Watson to answer that.
Thank you. Question to Director Watson.
Through you, Madam Mayor, I made my statements based on the best knowledge I have. I'm not going to confirm or deny or argue with Councillor Smith about something that I don't purport to know about.
The other thing here is I'm actually going to put on my hat, my fireman's hat. I spent 10 years in the New South Wales Fire Brigade and even fought fires in Ku-ring-gai at the time when the fires were threatening. Now, one of the things which I find a concern with this is when I look at Mimosa Oval, it's not a couple of 100 metres outside Sheldon Forest, it's actually hard up against Sheldon Forest, or when we're looking at on a map. Now, I understand that the Fire Brigade aren't going to use that as a set-up zone, but it's actually a fire break. It would be used as a fire break zone as it is now. The concern that I have, it being synthetic, that actually becomes another hazard and another toxin once, even though we looked at some footage today to show that it won't physically catch a light anymore, it's still giving off, it's burning a plastic, which is a risk and something that would be very difficult to be utilised as a fire break, and I do believe will pose a risk to homes around it. As a fireman, I actually fought the fires in these type of zones and had the unfortunate experience to even see grass catch on fire and even grass roots under dirt catch on fire. Now, that's a problem, but at the same time, it wasn't a plastic. It wasn't something that we had to worry about. It was grass, it was burning, and it wasn't giving off any type of vapour, so that we were quite comfortable in taking that on. So my concern is, again, with the toxicity of the fire. I believe, being a councillor in Ku-ring-gai, that we do have to look at where we're putting facilities for our children to play sports and even adults. I believe that we've got to give our residents somewhere to go and walk and enjoy, and the bird life. I think Ku-ring-gai is a little bit different than some of the other councils that have taken this on, as we do have a lot more green space, we have a lot more forest, we have a lot more of that around us. And I do understand what Director Watson is saying, is that we're forced upon, well, the state government is requesting us to take on more numbers, population growth, we've got to find more places for these people to play. I believe that at some point the state government's got to acknowledge the fact that we do live in a green zone, we do live in an area with a lot of trees and a lot of forest, and it does deserve to be protected, and maybe it should be looked at what they can do with our ovals with using grass. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Councillor Nye.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I would like to speak against the amendment. Now to start off with, I do acknowledge the Nesrock Regional Sports Ground strategy. I used to be a vice president of Nesrock, so I was about when this regional sports ground strategy was first launched. And it is true, based on the modelling in that sports ground strategy, the Northern Sydney area needs an additional 26% of increased sports ground supply by 2026, and an additional 40% between now and 2036 in order to provide for the healthy and active living of our residents in the Northern Sydney area. And if you take the opportunity to actually read through the sports ground strategy, Even on the first few pages in the executive summary, it provides some of the methods through which we can provide increased sports ground usage for our residents. So out of the 13 recommended options available, number one was to increase the supply and capacity of sports grounds, which is quite difficult when we're already space constrained. Option 4 is to install or upgrade lighting in our existing sports grounds areas. So that means if you install lighting there, then not only can you play during the daytime, but you can also play in the evenings. Option 7 is to install multi-purpose synthetic surfaces or special purpose surfaces. So that's what we're talking about right now with Mimosa and Norman Griffiths. And the idea with these special surfaces is that because they're more durable than conventional grass, we can play on those surfaces a lot longer before it reaches a point where it's too dangerous to play. However, I personally believe that out of those 13 options, whilst we're always calling out the lighting, option 4, and the synthetic surfaces, option 7, we've neglected to pay attention to option 2. And if you think about it, option 2 probably is more important than option 4 and option 7. So what is option 2? Option 2 is that we need to work with sports to develop and implement game formats and programs to create more yield, so greater intensity of use. And what does that mean? It means sometimes you may have, say, a soccer field, which is 70 by 100, indeed, like in dimensions, and you've got 22 on the field at the time. And that's good, you've got 22 people exercising. But what that means is you've got this very large amount of land for people to exercise, but there's a lot of land that's not really being used. Instead, I look at, say, the West Linfield Sports and Recreational Centre, where we have much smaller synthetic surfaces, 5 aside, and it's a much smaller format. Everyone's intensely playing. It's making use of a much smaller piece of land. Our residents are still being healthy, they're still exercising, they're still having fun. And you know, if we actually consider the yield or the intensity of use across Ku-ring-gai, that may go towards delivering or meeting the sporting needs of our residents. So I understand with the football club, there's over 1,000 members of the West Pymble Football Club, and that's great. And we want to encourage all 1,000 to stay healthy. But is the answer to put a synthetic surface on Mimosa, which if I look at Google Maps, the dimensions are about 115 by 95. Well, if I get a soccer field, an international standard soccer field, that's 70 by 100, and then you add about a 5-metre buffer around it so that people can run up and do a kick, and it's per the Australian Football Federation's regulations anyway, and then you put a fence around it, how much space is left for Mimosa? There's not very much space at all. Yes, there's enough space for a walking track, but that walking track and the space sort of to left and right, there's only really about 6, 7, 8 metres wide of a walking track, and it's kind of a depressing walking track from my perspective. If we were to install a full-size soccer field and have the 5-metre buffer around it and a fence. So I personally believe that in the long term, Mimosa does need probably a synthetic sports thing, but it needs to be much smaller, 5-a-side courts, and it shouldn't take up the whole of Mimosa. We could install 6 quite easily and only take up half of Mimosa. And finally, I don't think the technology is quite there yet. I think in about maybe 10 years' time, the technology would be better, and any runoff into Sheldon Forest might be more tolerable, but not with the current technology. Thank you.
Councillor Spencer.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Just a question to the General Manager, whether we have 2 for and 2 against, and if we could put the matter to a vote. Thank you.
General Manager.
In terms of the amendment, I have Councillors Clark and Mayor Anderson as speaking for, and Councillor Smith and Councillor Nye as speaking against.
So could we put the matter to a vote?
For the amendment,
Correct.
you may. You wish to do
Yes,
so?
I'm sorry. I was just going to say I need a seconder. Do I need a seconder?
Yes,
Thank
do.
you.
Councillor Pettit, you're seconding that. That is that the amendment be put. All those in favour? That is Yes, we're voting on whether we put the amendment now. That is unanimous. Therefore, the amendment that we are dealing with is Councillor Clark's amendment, which is the officer's recommendation with an extra part D. All those in favour? That is Councillors Clark and Anderson. Against? Councillors Nye, Pettit, Spencer, Greenfield, Chatto, Smith, Kelly, Kay. The debate now resumes on the original motion. Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. All right, that's perfectly fine. I think now we have to really consider the viability of going ahead with Norman Griffith. Through you, Madam Mayor, during our briefing it was brought up the potential of liability of councillors who proceed with, and council staff who proceed with motions, especially given the flood risk at Norman Griffith. I'm through you if the liability concerns could be discussed and brought forward.
Director Watson, are you able to respond to that?
Through you, Madam Mayor, what I was alluding to in the briefing was it's ordinary practice that a number of council officers would sign off on a REF, and in the event that the example being export of that material into the creek, if that was deemed to be environmental harm, it may well be the officers that had signed that REF would be personally responsible for prosecution, and there has been precedent in that respect in the past. So the question was put to me, was I happy with a 2% chance every year that large amounts of material could be exported off-site, and my answer to that is no. I don't consider that to be acceptable.
Councillor Spencer.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Same question again to the General Manager. Whether have we achieved 2 for and 2 against?
General Manager.
Madam Mayor and councillors, in relation to the original motion, I have councillors Pettit and Kelly as speaking for, and councillors Chatto and Clark speaking against.
So can we now put the matter to a vote?
Sorry, point of order about that.
Point of order, Councillor Clark.
I don't believe I've spoken against this matter at any point. I've only ever spoken for the amendment. I've only ever asked questions during the, unless we're now counting questions as counting against.
Well, if you've only asked questions, then you can speak, if you wish to do so at this point.
Sorry, can you just wait 1 second? I'm sorry, can I just seek your indulgence? So is it correct that we have 2 for and 1 against?
Correct.
Thank you.
No, point of order, Madam Mayor.
Yes,
My understanding is Councillor Chatto, although she did speak, it was a question rather than an against. Is that correct, Councillor Chatto?
I did say I could support Part A.
Yeah.
I was speaking for.
Yes.
Yeah, so you haven't had
That's right. Thank you. So the next speaker is Councillor Kelly.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I have a question for Director Watson. Director, if you were not willing to take a 2% risk of a flood, would you be willing to back a 98% risk that there wasn't a flood?
Do you wish to answer that, Director Watson?
Through you, Madam Mayor, as soon as I say we're in the middle of a drought, it's going to rain, so I'm not backing in anything at the moment.
Councillor Clark.
Well, look, now I will speak against this motion. Well, I can fully accept that Council is not willing to go ahead with Roth Park, and I appreciate the democratic process has occurred in this case. With that in mind, I cannot, in good conscience, support proceeding with Norman Griffith. Council simply does not have the funds to proceed with this motion, ignoring the environmentals, which should absolutely not be ignored. 2% risk is enormous. And as the chair of the Flood Risk Management Committee and as someone who's been able to work with flood experts time and time again, I'm incredibly concerned about that level of risk for flood. We don't have the money to build this project. I think council has, we have actually put a number of projects forward that are currently unfunded. I'd be concerned about putting just another project into the pile of projects which we just don't have money for. We noted this, that the grant we have received of almost $1 million to go ahead with this project is currently associated with Roth Park. We've already asked once for it to be transferred from Norman Griffith to Roth Park. Now we're going to go back and ask for it to be transferred back to Norman Griffith. I think that's going to be concerning, to say the least. Also, there's the time limit on how long we actually have for this grant. We're reliant on the idea that a grant is somehow going to be extended. I'm concerned about that also going forward. So if we were to commit ourselves to going to Norman Griffith, we could be potentially committing ourselves to building an artificial turf where we actually don't have the $1 million funding. So then we've got to not only raise the large amount of money for the gross pollution trap, we have to raise the large amount of money for the underground hydrology works, but we also then would have to raise $1 million to pay for the field itself. I think that'd be irresponsible governance at that point to proceed. So given that I don't think Norman Griffith is reasonable, I believe that as Director Watson has alluded to, he's not comfortable with a 2% risk at Norman Griffith. I personally, as a councillor and the chair of the Flood Risk Management Committee, am not comfortable with a 2% risk of flooding at Norman Griffith, and therefore I cannot support this motion going forward. I think that if we can't have it at Rolf, then clearly Norman Griffith doesn't work. There's a reason we changed it in the first place. We didn't change from Norman Griffith because it would be fun to move it to Rolf. It clearly hasn't been, and it's caused a lot of community angst. So given all of these issues, I can't see how, as councillors, we could be putting this project forward at Norman Griffith, and therefore I would say that we actually should can this entire project and reconsider it from the ground at this point. Thank you.
I will also echo those statements and more, Councillor Clark, because I'm very confident that Ku-ring-gai Council is quite renowned in Sydney metropolitan local government circles as having outstanding staff in the area of environment and sustainability. And our staff have clearly indicated that the ramifications of moving to Norman Griffith are unacceptable in terms of environmental and sustainability issues, the risk of flood, the safety for the community on Yanko Road, the risks of a material moving off-site in the event of flooding have all been outlined by our specialist staff, not to mention the movers of this motion being unable to identify funding for it. The escalation of the costs produces a huge gap. There's no certainty about the grants that exist for it and no source of funding for the gap. So I cannot support this in good faith either. Councillor Spencer.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I think I've got this right now. Could I put this matter to a vote?
We have had sufficient speakers.
Yes. And I need a seconder, of course.
Seconded by Councillor Pettit. So, councillors, we are now voting that the motion be put, not on the motion yet, we're voting that it be put. All those in favour? That is unanimous. So now we move to seek a summing up by the mover, Councillor Pettit.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. It's certainly been a long evening so far on this particular agenda item. Councillors, we do have a number of other unfunded projects elsewhere which we've already approved, which are a lot more than the Norman Griffith situation. Was even alluded to in regards to the Marion Street Theatre. That's a $10 million project. Now, councillors, we also were advised during the discussions and the questions that the cricketers are not happy at to going with Norman Griffiths. So we have the locals not happy, we have the cricket club not happy with the proposed synthetic field at Mimosa. The football club, they seem to be accepting second best. They would prefer it at their home ground. Nobody seems happy with the Mimosa proposal. It seems we're accepting something that nobody's going to be really happy with overall. I would love to see the West Pymble Football Club have their own synthetic field right at their home ground. It's as simple as that. Councillors, with the funding, what do we want to be known as? A can-do council or as a, oh no, we can't do council. It's all just too hard. Let's wait for another report. Let's make a decision. Let's go with what is right for the community, and that is to have it at Norman Griffiths. Leave Mimosa as a natural turf field. It will bring the wider community back together. We will stop having this email warfare. We will stop having the petition warfare. Councillors, you would have received emails and petitions, and it seemed to be with the petitions, who's got the most numbers? This is nonsense. The community should be working together, not against each other. So councillors, I commend this motion to you. It makes sense. Give the community solid direction. You heard from Councillor Smith about the fire situation. I will defer to his expertise in that situation, and we all should. I mean, he's been there and done that. I mean, if you can't take the wise words of a fireman with years of experience in saying that Mimosa is not the appropriate location, who can you take the expertise from? Councillors, we have an opportunity to give a clear direction on a synthetic field with long-term benefits for the wider community that will once again bring our community, West Pymble, Turramurra, and the football community. They want their synthetic field. They know that they've got more and more players wanting to play, and that will continue to grow. Having it at Norman Griffiths will attract more players to that club. It's got the location, it's got the parking, we've got everything around it, the swimming pool, the netball. It just adds into a consolidated sporting precinct. Councillors, please do the right thing. Have the vision, take it forward as is. Thank you.
I will now put that motion, Councillor Pettit's motion. All those in favour? That is Councillors Nye, Pettit, Spencer, Kelly, Kay. Against Councillors Clark, Greenfield, Chatto, Smith, Anderson. Is that 5 then? Therefore, I use my casting vote against the motion. The motion is lost. Councillors, we move on in the agenda. General Manager, extra reports circulated to the meeting.
There are none, Madam Mayor.
We move to motions of which due notice has been given. NM1, planning proposal for 45 to 47 Tennyson Avenue and 105 Eastern Road, Turramurra. Is there a motion? Councillor Spencer.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I move NM1 as printed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there a seconder for NM1 as printed? Councillor Kelly. Councillor Spencer.
Thank you. I shall now speak to the motion. Now, shortly after I was elected in 2017, I conducted a site inspection as chair of the Ku-ring-gai Traffic Committee. It was about the bus zone at Eastern Road between Ellis Street and Tennyson Avenue. Buses were alighting passengers in the middle of Eastern Road because cars were parked too close together, and there were further concerns about dangerous crossing between parked cars and at the zebra crossing. Following that, in early 2018, I put up a motion to look at widening Colleton Street and Burns Road. As a result of that motion, staff conducted a traffic study on the area and reported that the widening of Kalitan Street has to include Burns Road and Eastern Road and beyond. In addition to road widening, Council needs to build footpaths at least on one side of Eastern Road. Today, Eastern Road has not been widened and footpaths are still being installed. In 2018, I received several complaints from Linfield residents. It was about the new Harris Farm in Linfield causing traffic and parking problems. There were issues with trolleys taking up car park spaces, and some were left along the neighborhood. I conducted a site inspection and attempted to mitigate the traffic problem by installing signs directing traffic from Linfield Avenue and Cusher Lane to Harris Farm's basement car park.
Councillor Spencer, could you be relevant to this site and
Yes.
this? Thank you.
Yes, it would be.
You
May I
need to
carry on?
be.
Thank you.
We don't need to talk about Linfield.
It is relevant. Okay.
I think there's
No,
a few
but I'm-
councillors who are
I'm-
disagreeing.
Sure, thank you. So Mr. Luke Harris acknowledged those issues in a letter to General Manager on 22nd October. Now, it has to be noted that we all know the Harris Farm is located along Linfield. I'm just finishing this off. And next to a train station and very close to Pacific Highway. Now, when I learned about their intention to build another Harris Farm in Eastern Road, I directed their project manager, Mr. David Hines, to a link on council website describing the traffic study conducted by staff. This was in August 2018. And the need for road widening in Eastern Road was clearly reported there. In addition, I asked that they conduct a community consultation. I believe they were equally, if not more, aware of the Aldi situation than most of us here. Now, the proposed Harris Farm in Eastern Road came out in March 2019 through a staff recommendation. It was unanimously carried without debate. I actually thought the development was a newer and better proposal, and I seconded it. However, I received a number of complaints soon after. I must admit I overlooked the opposition to the development. Among other things, the residents' concerns were similar to what I have described. Traffic was their major concern. I then realized that the gravity of the situation, and as the ward councillor for Ku-ring-gai, I put up this motion to withdraw the proposed rezoning for Harris Farm in Eastern Road. My reasoning is that when there is a conflict between council and the constituents, I stand with the constituents. Harris Farm is not the target here. My wife goes to Harris Farm in St. Ives every other day. The good things said about Harris Farm are all consistent with my views. I now ask Harris Farm as a corporate citizen to go back to the community and work with them. Do a proper consultation. The community is not their enemy. They are your customers. I am happy to work with Harris Farm as their ward councillor. With regards to the motion tonight, there are 3 councillors in 2016 that were re-elected and are here today. They will be versed in the Aldi events in 2016 where they voted unanimously against the development. I ask the 3 councillors and the others here tonight to vote for this motion. More importantly, I ask my fellow ward councillor Donna Greenfield to vote for this motion. Knowing what I know today, I cannot support the proposal for 45 to 47 Tennyson Avenue and 105 Eastern Road. Thank you.
And the seconder is Councillor Kelly.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Pardon me. I'll be brief on this. Obviously, Councillor Spencer has dealt with a lot of this, the same as Councillor Pettit stole my thunder the last time round. I'll sit here and sulk for a while, I guess. My reason for speaking in favour of this notice of motion is the overwhelming representation that's been made to me by the residents in and around Tennyson and Eastern Road area that'll be impacted directly by this proposed development. I have no axe to grind about Harris Farm. Don't have a wife who shops there, but that's okay, I'm happy. The bottom line is that I'm deferring, I guess, to the residents and their wishes over and above those of Harris Farm, only because they are the louder voice. And it's not so much that they're a vocal group, but they have a fairly strong belief that this development's not good for their area. And I did some research into the Aldi development as well, and I think that, as Councillor Spencer said, it wasn't supported when it came around. I believe that Harris Farm have their opportunity to have their case heard like any developer anywhere, but in this case, not here and not now. And with the support of the residents, I'm hopefully representing them faithfully in saying that I support Councillor Spencer's notice of motion, and I commend that to the other councillors here. Thank you.
Councillor Kay, you are the next speaker.
Okay, now I'm speaking to support the motion. Now I want people to make it very aware and clear that, for starters, I do not work for Alistair Henskins, which is our state MP. Now I also do not work for Mr Harris or Harris Farm, and I do not work for council staff. But I do work with the other councillors to achieve an outcome that is best for the residents that I believe of Ku-ring-gai. I have nothing against Mr Harris per se or the business model of Harris Farm, and I've embraced the experience by having one in St Ives, which has been welcomed by the community. I do personally believe in this instance that the location of 45 to 45 Tennyson Avenue and 105 Eastern Road is not a suitable location and would be better located near transport hubs, i.e. the upcoming Turramurra Hub or Town Centre looking towards the future. I have listened to the concerns of the residents regarding the traffic and the effects on small business, and I've taken this on board, and I do appreciate your feedback. I am in favour of keeping the local shopping village at the site, so I do support this motion.
The next speaker is Councillor Clark.
Oh, thank you, Madam Mayor. I'm just going to start with a couple of questions through to Councillor Spencer. Councillor Spencer, I believe you mentioned that you had a meeting on the 18th of August with members of Harris Farm. I'm not sure exactly who. You said August, but I believe this official date was the 18th, at least from what I've heard, but please feel free to clarify. During this meeting, in your role as the chair of the traffic committee, what did you discuss with the Harris Farm proprietors or the individuals involved?
Councillor Spencer.
Thank you for the question. I can't remember exactly, but it was around September, October. I had a meeting, and this was at the Linfield site where the traffic and so on was a concern. So I attended that site, firstly to look at the traffic situation there, and this was followed up by a letter from Mr. Luke Harris to our general manager requesting for assistance with directional signs directing traffic from Kusha Lane and Linfield Avenue into Harris Farm's car park. And of course we discussed having people there to mitigate the trolley situation. In addition to that, we discussed the new Harris Farm in Eastern Road. So that was at the time where I alluded to Mr. David Hines that we have a traffic situation. We had a traffic study along Carleton Street all the way up to Eastern Road, and he has to look at that to address that situation there. And of course, they would know about the Aldi situation much better than me. And I also said that it is very important that they take the community with them. They have to do a proper consultation and so on. I hope I've answered Councillor Clark's question.
Councillor Clark.
Thank you. And another question for you, Councillor Spencer. Councillor Spencer, you had this meeting in August, and then on the 26th of the 3rd, 2019, you supported me in seconding the motion to pass forward for gateway approval for this site. I'm wondering, in the 5 months, how you managed to forget the traffic issues and then pass this motion.
Councillor Spencer.
Well, I did not forget the traffic situation. I did say that I second the motion and it was carried unanimously. And I might add that the 3 councillors that were there in 2016 are also here today, and they supported this. But in 2016, those 3 councillors, namely Councillor Pettit, Chateau and Anderson, and the other councillors during that term unanimously voted against Aldi. I think the much more better way for me to put this is to say, I thought it was a newer and much better proposal. But I made a mistake because after that, I received a number of complaints soon after. And therefore, I am here today to try and correct that mistake. Thank you.
Councillor Clark.
Thank you. That's an interesting position, Councillor Spencer, but thank you. Well, I'm going to be speaking against this notice of motion. I think that it's really been quite confusing that we've seen this motion come forward 8 months after its passage through council. This gateway, I think we also now have to understand what we're actually been considering here, because I think there's been a lot of misinformation floating around in the community. This is not a DA approval. We are not approving a DA. What we are doing is we are changing from R2 zoning to B1. Right? That's what's happening here, right? All right, so this site has been used for commercial since the 1950s. In the 1950s, it had a servo built on the site, and I believe it was the 80s that the bus depot was converted to a nursery. So all we're doing is recognising the use of this land. There's been this weird comparison saying this is the same as Aldi, and that's patently false. The FSR that Aldi was seeking was to match the existing FSR of the IJ, etc. shops along Eastern Road, which is 0.75 to 1. The FSR being sought by the Harris proposal is actually 0.3 to 1. This is actually less than half the FSR of the current existing shops. So to say it's out of scale is a really weird statement. And I've been very confused by that comment, because it just simply isn't. That's just not true from the FSR being proposed. The Aldi site was looking to have 1,900 square metres. This site is 540 square metres, with the actual floor supermarket being 1,000 square metres. This is actually half the size of the Aldi proposal. So it's half the size, half the FSR. So clearly, to make the statement that it's out of scale is confusing.
I'm sorry, point of order. I did not make a statement that is out of scale. I do not. Someone else might have. Thank you.
You can be seated, Councillor Spencer. I don't think Councillor Clark is referring to your comments. He's referring to comments in community debate on the matter.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the clarification.
Councillor Clark.
Yes, that is correct, Madam Mayor. I'm referring to the general statements being put out in the community. I think that we also need to understand the traffic that's been going on, because we've been talking a lot about traffic here. The RMS traffic statements by their impulse is going an 8% increase during weekdays and a 12% maximum increase during weekends. We're not talking about 80,000 car movements, 80,000 customers per week.
Ladies and gentlemen in the gallery, you must remain silent. The time for public comment was a week ago, when councillors remained silent listening to your statements. You are to remain silent and exhibit the same courtesy as councillors did last week. And if anybody disrupts the meeting, I have the authority to have them removed. So please, we would like to see you sit quietly and watch the democratic process, but you cannot disrupt the meeting, and the police can be called if there is disruption. Yes, well, we'll see who's got the last laugh. Under point 15.14 of the meeting, anybody who calls out in the meeting will be asked to leave by the officer at the back. So please remain silent, or you won't be staying in the meeting. Councillor Clark, please continue.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. That's an interesting one to jump back into. It kind of derails your thought process a little bit.
Indeed.
Indeed. But look, I think when we have to consider this site, it is currently being used as a commercial site. All we're doing is changing what it is, but it is fitting with the current idea. It seems to me this really comes down to a desire to not have competition. I don't support protectionism, and I don't believe, and I could be corrected, that this is even a planning consideration, competition for shops. But actually, at this point, I'd like to ask a question through you, Madam Mayor. Is competition considered as part of a planning proposal?
I believe it is in fact commented upon in the report. Director Watson, are you able to respond to that?
Through you, Madam Mayor, competition is not a planning consideration, no. The matter has been settled by the High Court in the late 1970s.
Indeed, it has been to the High Court. Councillor Kay might like to be aware of that, as she cited that as one of her reasons for supporting Councillor Spencer's notice of motion, but it is not a planning consideration.
Well, thank you,
It is
Madam.
not a lawful planning consideration.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Well, given competition is not, in fact, a lawful planning consideration, I'm not going to be using competition as a lawful as a consideration for this. So we really have to consider this site overall. So I've heard these numbers thrown of 2,000-3,000 square metres for this site. It's just not true. It's just not what's being proposed. It's not what we're allowing them.
Who said that? Officer, did you see who said that? I am warning that person. If you speak again and you are identified, you'll be leaving. Councillor Clark, I'm sorry for the rudeness in the gallery that is disrupting tonight's proceedings. Please continue.
That's all right, Madam Mayor. Look, the reality is that we've heard a number of members of the community. In fact, over the last couple of days, Harris Farm themselves have put up their change.org, which has now got over 600 signatures going forward for it. In fact, from that, we have near 150 of those being from the direct area that we'd be pulling to this site. So that's, Ku-ring-gai, South Turramurra, places where I would go from, for example, being a Turramurra resident. In fact, just the other day, I was shopping at Eastern Road Precinct. So I think given that we have now a number of residents actually coming forward for this proposal, I think it makes sense to go forward to the proper full community consultation, which would only occur if we continue the process. In fact, I'm not sure if it's known at this stage, but the site actually has now been given gateway approval by the Department of Planning. So now it has been 3 government groups who have approved this site. It's been council, it's been our independent planning panel, and now it has been given full gateway approval. So at this stage, I think it's appropriate to allow the process to continue. I believe, of course, the community consultation should not be occurring during the holiday Christmas period, and we should be making sure that it occurs during a time where all residents can fully articulate themselves. I believe right now what we've had is one side especially coming forward, whilst not allowing other residents the full time and the proper process to go through the community consultation. During this community consultation period, all views can be considered, and then we can actually make a final balanced opinion. If it comes back that literally 99% of residents don't want this, then we don't have to do it. But we haven't had that process yet, and until we have that process, we can't make this decision. Therefore, I think that we should be continuing this project. Nothing has changed in 8 months. The idea that something has suddenly changed now makes no sense to me. Given the minimal traffic impacts, the FSR being lower.
Silence in the gallery.
Given that the FSR is significantly lower than the current existing buildings, I think it's perfectly appropriate. This site's been commercial for over 70 years. And this is really recognising that, in fact, it is a commercial site. So I cannot commend this motion to the floor, and I encourage every councillor here to vote it down and allow the democratic process to continue.
Thank you. I will point out also that Councillor Spencer suggested that Harris Farm conduct a proper community consultation. It is not their role to undertake the community consultation. The public exhibition will be conducted by council under the gateway approval process. Harris Farm did, however, undertake a non-statutory exhibition or a community consultation of their own volition. And they already have done so. I don't think one could ask more than that, and that's probably highly unusual that a proponent would do that in the first place. So Harris Farm would not be responsible for the next round of public exhibition and community consultation. Council would be. Councillor Greenfield.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Firstly, through you to the relevant director, I'd just like to confirm, now that it's gone through Gateway, the next process would be to put the development or the proposal out for public exhibition, correct?
Yes. Would you like me to ask the director to give the details of
Yes,
that?
please.
Director Watson, please.
Thank you.
Through you, Madam Mayor, there was conditions attached to the Gateway which required Council to prepare, adopt and exhibit concurrently with the planning proposal DCP provisions specific to the site. We wouldn't anticipate being able to report those back to Council until February next year. I assume it's the third week, the usual cycle. So assuming Council adopts those documents at that point in time, you would not see exhibition start before the last week in February, the first week in March. So it's not, as alluded to by Councillor Clark, it's not something we'll be advertising over the Christmas break. People will be back, and it won't be till the second or third month of next year.
Okay, thank you. Mayor Anderson, for the gallery's benefit, could the director explain what a DCP is?
Director, would you explain the DCP, please?
Sorry, Madam Mayor, I'll cop that one. Development Control Plan. Sorry for the acronyms. So that would be a level of site-specific controls that sit below an LEP that give greater confidence to things like setback, landscape controls, built form controls, things like that. So they would be exhibited at the same time. Bearing in mind, as was suggested by a number of speakers, this isn't a DA. There is already a fair bit of detail around what is proposed for the site. Now, while we can't guarantee that the developer will do that, that's for a separate DA process, we would use those sorts of plans that have already been prepared to inform a development control plan. So they would serve to ensure that some of the things that the developer has put out into the community so far would flow through to a DA ultimately.
Thank you. So once we have the community, if the motion was not successful and we had the community consultation, if there was a large community not supporting the proposal, then what would be the outcome? What would be the next step, please?
Director Watson, can you...
Through you, Madam Mayor, at that point in time, Council could recommend to the Minister that the planning proposal not proceed. That is ultimately a decision for the Minister or his delegate, but Council can, based on feedback it receives during the submission period, amend the proposal, amend the DCP, decide to proceed as is, or any other combination therein, including recommend it not proceed at all.
And if there's a large part of the community that does support it, and it's more than the people that are against it, what would be the next step?
Well, I will say it's not necessarily a popularity contest, yes, I understand what you're asking, but obviously the council officers and the councillors have to assess it, as Councillor Clark has mentioned, based on lawful planning considerations. But Director, you may be able to explain more about that.
Through you, Madam Mayor, it's quite common for issues to be raised during the exhibition that weren't thought of, weren't fully worked through, so it's not uncommon for changes to be made. And quite often an applicant himself might pick up on things that arise out of that feedback process. But after Council considers it and makes a recommendation to the Minister would then decide whether or not to make a plan in a particular form, submitted or not submitted. And then once that LEP or the planning proposal is gazetted, you then go through a formal DA process, which again involves another level of public consultation.
Okay. So there's actually two forms of consultation with this process. The first one where we go out for exhibition, then we come back with some plans, and then there's another form of consultation.
Through you, Madam Mayor, and as alluded to by the Mayor, there was some non-statutory consultation prepared by the carried out by the applicants themselves.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Councillor Nye.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I would like to speak for this motion. Now, originally I wasn't planning to speak on this motion at all. Like, there's already 3 people here who have spoken for the motion. My personal view on this matter is I've got nothing against Harris Farm. I actually like Harris Farm. I enjoy shopping at Harris Farm, etc. But my view on this now, after listening to some of the concerns of local residents, and also listening to the concerns of residents who are both for and against this general development, is that perhaps it's more appropriate for us to wait until the new LEP is done, and that this development, well, this sort of development in this sort of area should be considered along with everything else when we do the new LEP. So that is my view. Now, on I'd like to just say one other thing, and actually 2 things. One is my view is although there has been a gateway determination, my understanding is that the Minister has said that it's best to await for Council's resolution here, whichever way it goes, before then considering the gateway determination. And my final point I'd like to make is, I know that Councillor Clark has spoken against this motion, but even though Councillor Clark has spoken against something, even Councillor Clark sometimes represents something that the audience might not like, and even though Councillor Clark and I sometimes disagree on things, I don't think it's correct and proper to just jeer at him and laugh at him and do all that sort of stuff from the audience. That to me is not acceptable. So if Councillor Clark has been democratically elected, and if he's coming up to speak on behalf of the residents who have voted for him, then I think we all deserve to, or we all should listen to him in silence, just as everyone else is. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Greenfield.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So as many councillors, I've received quite a few emails, both for and against the Harris Farm proposal on Eastern Road. Just crashed into the microphone. Just over 200 individuals have written to me about the development, and I would say probably 90% of the emails have been against the development. I have read and heard the residents' concerns, and I've also seen the change.org site, which has been established approximately a week ago. There's been over 600 signatures supporting the development. I've also been contacted by a group of residents who support the development as well. They're saying they're looking forward to be able to go and have a coffee with their children in an orchard, and they always loved going to...
Silence in the gallery.
And they always loved going to the nursery where their children thought it was like a fairyland with all the lovely flowers and trees. This demonstrates to me, both the emails and the change.org, plus the community group that contacted me today, that there is both for and against the development in the community. Understanding that the process, if we go to public consultation, is there is a large number of submissions against the development, we will make a decision one way or the other. As elected members of council, our role is to listen to both sides of the community. Both for and against have a voice, and numbers of residents are clear that a formal public consultation putting the development on exhibition for the community to comment. If the NOM is defeated tonight and the proposal proceeds, the timeframes would be reasonable to expect the exhibition probably end of Feb, which means that we will avoid all the Christmas holidays and all the concerns where residents aren't available to make comment or make submissions. So I'm voting against the notice of motion tonight because I feel that there is an appetite on both sides of the fence, both for and against, and a formal consultation with the community giving everyone an opportunity to comment, I believe is what we should be doing. Thank you.
The next speaker is Councillor Kelly.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Who'd have put money on this? 2 ward councillors, 1 for, 1 against in the same night. But we've had 2 for, 2 against, I think, General Manager, and therefore I'd like to put this motion to the floor. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Councillors will now be voting as to whether the motion should be put. Those in favour? That is unanimous. Therefore, the mover of the motion, Councillor Spencer, may sum up.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. And I thank my colleague for her view as well. Now, I just wish that certain things to be clarified. So, firstly, the department had approved the rezoning of the site, which is from R2 low-density residential to B1 neighborhood center, and to remove the minimum lot size standard. This was last Wednesday, 13th of November. At this point of time, the department...
Point of order, Madam Mayor. That was not my understanding. Could I please have some clarification?
Unfortunately, we can't answer questions in the middle of a sum up. It's too late.
May I carry on?
Spencer.
Thank you. At this point of time, the Department of Planning and Environment has not seen fit to issue a gateway determination to allow the planning proposal to be publicly exhibited. This was clarified by the Minister in his letter to our General Manager and our local MP, and this was last Friday on the 15th of November. I fear that if this motion is lost tonight and that it is to proceed to gateway, we are telling the department and the Minister that Council has considered everything and we are good to go. But next time, the Minister may not step in to rescue our community. And I ask councillors to vote in favour of this motion. Thank you.
Councillors, I will now be putting Councillor Spencer's motion. Are those in favour? That is Councillors Nye, Pettit, Spencer, Kelly, Kay. Against, Councillors Clark, Greenfield, Shatto, Smith, Anderson. I use my casting vote against the motion. It is lost. We now move to NM2. Notice of a rescission from Councillors Spencer, Nye and Pettit, dated 23rd of October 2019. Councillor Spencer.
I would like to put the motion as printed. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Spencer's moving that motion as printed. Is there a seconder for that motion? Councillor Nye. Councillor Spencer.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I actually have nothing more to add to what is already printed.
Sorry, Councillor?
I have nothing more to add to what is printed and what was discussed in the last meeting. I believe we had a very robust discussion, and that, I believe, has covered most of the things that this rescission motion is about, and I leave it as that. Thank you.
Councillor Nye has seconded. Do you wish to speak to this?
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor. I'd just like to reiterate the points I said at the last council meeting. I do believe that for the Sydney North Planning Panel, it is very important to have continuity. I also personally believe that not only should we have continuity, but that the membership of Sydney North Planning Panel should ideally be staggered so that you don't have the same two people going on and leaving at the same time. I note that in the last ordinary meeting of council, Councillor Clark said, well, you've got 3 other government-appointed panel members, so there is a staggering in place already, and that is true. However, I also note that in many boards, in many committees, the standard practice is, even if there are different classes of members, that there is staggering even within those classes of members, so that even within classes of members, not everyone leaves at the same time. I personally I would have preferred the motion or amendment. I forgot what I moved, like whether it was a motion or amendment last time, but I would have preferred that we had an orderly transition where I step down and one other councillor steps on, and then in a year's time, Councillor Spencer steps down and another councillor steps on. I think that would have been much more orderly and much better and it's in the interest of Ku-ring-gai Council, I personally believe. I do believe also that Councillor Spencer and I were adequately qualified to sit on the planning panel. Councillor Spencer with his legal and traffic qualifications, myself with my engineering background. I saw no problem with what I had moved or amended at the last ordinary meeting of council. I do disagree with the outcome of what happened last month, because now we've not just changed one member, but we changed two members all at the same time. It represents a bit of disruption. It represents a lack of continuity. It's against the spirit of what I believe is in the planning panel operating procedures, and so that is why I am happy to support Councillor Spencer in his current notice of rescission. Thank you.
If there are no further speakers on this matter, Councillor Spencer, do you wish to sum up?
I would just ask this council to do the right thing. The term arguably has not expired. The tenure was for 3 years, and it's quite unusual, extraordinary, to remove someone from their tenure. Thank you.
Councillors, I will put Councillor Spencer's notice of motion. All those in favour? That is Councillors Nye, Pettit, Spencer, Kelly, Kay. Against Councillors Clark, Greenfield, Shatto, Smith, Anderson. I will use my casting vote against the motion. That is lost. Councillors, business without notice, subject to clause 9.3 of Code of Meeting Practice.
I'm sorry. Okay, yeah. Sorry.
No business without notice. Councillors, questions without notice? None. I believe there are no inspections committees. We have one item of confidential business to deal with, and I seek a motion to move into closed session. Moved Councillor Clark, seconded Councillor Pettit. All those in favour? That is unanimous of those around the horseshoe, with Councillor Spencer out of the room. I'm afraid the members of the public in the gallery will have to depart, and we will be closing the doors and the staff will be departing, and microphones will need to be off. Councillors, we're back in open session. Director Marshall.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. In the closed session, Council made a resolution and the General Manager's performance review item C1 was adopted as per the recommendation as printed in the business paper.
Thank you, councillors. There being no further business, sorry, Councillor Spencer.
Just a procedural question.
Procedural?
Yes. Whether the amendment that was lost should be recorded as well is normally the case.
I've written it all down and the governance staff will follow that.
Oh, lovely. Thank you.
Thank you. So there being no further business, I declare the meeting closed at 10:15 p.m.